Hey guys, welcome to the Booster Pack. This is the show where we're normally unwrapping the stories and cracking the mysteries of collectible game history, but this is the rare slot. That's the mini episodes, departing from our normal format of interviews with contributors to the collectible card game genre. We are taking a topic-centric view in this episode. So our normal episode will return in our next one, but for now, we have got ourselves a tiny little interview, an original one, in fact, our first rare slot original interview. Our previous ones have been excerpts from the core Booster Pack episodes, but this one is an original one, and I'm so happy to be joined by my guest today. So before we bring him in, let's just have a little preamble about where games are at the moment. There is been a little trend in games, especially video games over the last few years, where we've seen a re-release of several classic titles under a remastered banner. Games like Super Mario 64 and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, classic 90s games, have both been remastered by their publishers in a recent setting, just giving a little tweaks here and there. Same thing, actually, we're waiting right now for Nintendo to re-release a new version of a old Zelda game, Skyward Sword. So with that in mind, it begs the question, why aren't we seeing this sort of remastering in tabletop games? Well, there's a little bit of noise in the board game category about that. Things like Hero Quest and stuff are coming out in a remastered version. And then we're guessing, why haven't we seen this in collectible games? So the category leader, Magic the Gathering, sort of started experimenting with this idea a couple of years ago in the digital space. They put on Magic the Gathering Online a remastering of their 1997 Tempest block. And more recently, they did a remastering online of their Almond Cat block. And then this year, they actually premiered the remastered line in paper, like physical cards, for the Time Spiral block. So what they did is they cut up their original couple of sets for that block and tweak some wording that didn't make sense back then, tweak some art, put the current card frame on cards, and released it quite successfully. So again, it begs the question, why aren't we seeing this in collectible games? Well, our guest today is somebody who has actually taken it upon themselves to do a fan remastering of a classic collectible card game, one that was very loved, but also incredibly hard to find back in its day. So we are joined today, I'm going to let him talk about the project, by Chris Malec. Chris, how are you?
Doing really well. Thanks for having me on.
That's okay. It sounds fascinating. This project of yours sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it was definitely a lot of work and just a lot of hours, kind of aided by the pandemic, because I really got the bulk of my work done last March and April.
So let me ask you, before we jump into the project, which is so exciting, like I said, Legend of Burning Sands Remastered, let's jump into your little history with collectible games first. So how did you start? Where did you first learn about collectible games, and what games did you first start playing?
The very first one was obviously Magic the Gathering. That's pretty much everyone's gateway, the gateway drug. I started back at the tail end of '94. The Dark was like the brand new set that had just been released, and we were anxiously awaiting, what Fallen Empires would, be able to provide for us.
Yeah, Leviathan was dominating the scene.
And, we just went along with things. Magic started to fall out of favor with us, but we had picked up Legend of the Five Rings. And we were like, wow, this is really cool. It was much more story-driven, more interactive in the way that the card mechanics worked. And we went through, like, all the way through the Day of Thunder. We had 5 people in our regular play group. And we were all, like, just really jazzed about hearing stories from tournaments of stuff that happened there. And we're like, wow, this is the best thing we have ever heard about. Like, where something weird would happen at a tournament and then they would make a card about it. And we were all utterly shocked to find out that, Legend of the Five Rings was going to end at the Day of Thunder. And then Wizards of the Coast bought Legend of the Five Rings, and the child project, Legend of the Burning Sands, they went into, that they had that rolling thunder distribution method, because they're like, oh, hey, we're going to revisit the Scorpion Clan coup, just so that, they could get their whole thing together. And it was just a small set followed by a small set followed by a small set. But that was not really very popular amongst collectors. And Legend of the Burning Sands kind of got caught into that, because the first 3 sets were released in that rolling thunder sort of way, but like the damage was already kind of done by the time they got to release the final set, The Awakening, which they released it as a giant set, which would have done well, but it also compressed, what was supposed to be a couple of years worth of story into one set. And it's just like, okay, you guys get 700 cards and that's your story. That's it.
I was going to ask you, did you jump from Legend of the Five Rings onto Legend of the Burning Sands?
We did. It was not really very popular in my play group. So like I remember having just like a handful of cards, like a couple starter decks, a fistful of booster packs, and that was about it. And it never really took off in my own play group.
So you stopped. So you stopped sort of engaging in the same CCGs at that point, and not playing the same sort of groups as much.
Yeah, we also really got big into Warhammer 40,000.
One vice for another. I get it.
Yeah, like I ended up selling off like most of my Magic cards somewhere along the way. At that point, for whatever I did, and I turned around and spent it on 40K models because I ended up becoming friends with one of the local vendors. So it was just like, oh, hey, I can go here and hang out and play, 40K for 2 days straight.
So that brings me to the question then. Like at this point, you've jumped away from CCGs a little bit. What sparked the idea of this Legend of the Burning Sands remaster? Like you said, it was a little blip on the radar that you never really got a chance to play back way back when it was being published, or as much of a chance to play as you would liked. What actually inspired this whole remaster to come about?
It's in many ways, it's one of the games that it's one of the best games that I never got a chance to play. Like I really like the mechanics, especially too, is like looking through the design, of Legend of the early days of Legend of the Five Rings, you can definitely see like they took so many of the concepts that they liked, but they, monkeyed around with the mechanics and like made it something more. Like they took what they learned and then they did something new and different with it as like a progressive iteration into like that style of mechanics, instead of basically winner take all for battles, like has always, as at the time was always the case for Legend of the Five Rings. It's Legend of the Burning Sands, the battles are very attrition based.
Yeah, there isn't like an overrun strategy.
And also too, like you can see, like in Legend of the Five Rings, you just had 4 provinces, but Burning Sands takes that concept like 1 or 2 steps further, where you actually get to choose, the portions of your faction's control, like the territories that your faction controls, and then like everyone chooses from the same pool, and then these things can have different effects, like on the game and on your whatever battles happen at them. But I always loved the mechanics of the game, but just I never got a chance to play it. And in 2006, 2005 or 2006, I it was just bumming around in Photoshop. I'm like, hey, I can just make proxy cards. And then I'm like, hey, I can just make proxy cards.
I think we've all had that revelation at one point. You're like, wait, what can I do?
I ended up talking to several people on the old Alderac forums, one of which I'm still in contact with. And on the Wikipedia page, there's like, oh, hey, there's a revival to try to think of, like, that was me. And like 4 of the guys. And we never really got far out of the planning stages. Greg was our like big graphic designer. I was basically like the mechanics, because I wanted to like kind of revisit the mechanics, because from a lot of the scans and stuff that I've seen, and I ended up learning not too long ago that Burning Sands was actually developed by basically 2 different teams that never talk to each other.
Oh, okay.
There's like how certain mechanics are described. Like there's take the top card of your deck and then look at the fate value of that card, and it appears all over the place, but it never had like a name or a concise way of performing the action, because it's described differently in just about every card that it shows up on. But in the fact it says, oh, this is all the same mechanic. So I'm like, well, I can just simplify that.
So this is something you were playing around with in 2006?
Yes.
So this is like for 10 years, over 10 years, 13 years, you've been tinkering with this idea of sort of giving Legend of the Burning Sands a new sort of and a more accessible vibrance to it. Because like you said, there's been these two conflicting, what do you call it? Like two conflicting sources that actually put out the final product, probably the AEG team and the Wizards of the Coast team.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I haven't really dug too far into, because I don't really have access to the people who actually designed the game. I only actually tangentially know like one person who worked on the story team.
Right.
So like we were originally going to put out like just a set of like 400 cards, just kind of like a mega set that captured the feel and flavor of Legend of the Burning Sands.
Back then, were you trying to make a new gameplay environment with the cards that existed?
Not really. Like we just want to like be able to play the game.
Right. Okay. That's the best goal.
So like ideas about like, hey, if this took off, we could definitely like start releasing our own personal expansions and telling new stories. That's even something like I've kind of thought about, but the scope of that kind of project is extremely daunting.
This looks amazing. Like I've taken a quick look at it. It looks really accessible. It looks really fresh. It almost looks like, some of the art maybe looked like that's done in the 90s, but like the templating and the way that the cards are laid out look really modern.
Like that was the thing that really popped and really drew me in, were these gorgeous card templates.
So when you say template, you mean like the card frames?
Yes.
So like in Legend of the Burning Sands, they've got like that stone wall templating that cuts into the picture. Just gorgeous stuff. And I mean, AEG did amazing work, like you said, with L5R and Legend of the Burning Sands. And to be honest with you, Doomtown and everything like that just looked amazing. Like every card looked like a work of art, not like Magic's like very, very modular frame. These things like almost felt like every component was naturally connected together.
But also too, like that also did have its drawbacks in that, like, with Legend of the Five Rings specific, like they had like this big kind of like frame where like, oh, there's a little circle cut out, and they're like, it looked cool, but also kind of got in the way of the art. So it was just like, it went a little too far in some ways. My goal for the card frames was to get to, for at least for the factions, like use as much of the original faction background as I could manage, and for things that I couldn't like use like the regular background for, come up with something that evokes that memory but still fits, more modern sensibilities.
So I guess my ask for you then, of course, is what do you like? Let's just pretend like the goal, if I'm not mistaken, with this project is to not only help old players who couldn't find these super rare cards to play the game, but also introduce the game maybe to another generation or keep it alive so that it isn't lost as a footnote to, Legend of the Five Rings history. What does the version that you've put out, Legend of the Burning Sands Remastered, really added in for the new player, or what really did you do to keep the new player in mind?
Well, again, templating for like, more modern standards. Sensibilities have changed since, the early 90s. So there was like some problematic language in in some of the card texts that I'm sorry, nope, you got to go.
Do you remember any examples?
Well, I mean, there were some racial slurs that were thrown around like pretty willy-nilly in the late 90s. Just like I've even been guilty of using those words at the time.
Socially acceptable things at, of the time.
Yeah. And also too, like on the site, I have like as much of the fiction. I think I got all of it. And like it's all included in, the packet with the rule book and everything. But I didn't really edit that because I'm like, like I go back to like the Warner Brothers cartoons where like, hey, these cartoons depict, opinions and things that were commonplace at the time. And if we just, edited them or did anything to them, like it's like saying that didn't happen. Like, no, this definitely happened.
Yeah, you don't want to erase the mistakes of the past.
Yeah, and it was basically the same philosophy for like a lot of the lore and the stories that were written. But as for like the stuff that's on the cards, because in my mind the cards are going to be the things that see the most use. Like you might read through the story once, maybe twice, but if you're playing the game, you're going to be playing with the cards all the time, and like that's just removing that particular barrier, to the people that might be offended. It just seemed like a really easy, a simple ask. Like, hey, this doesn't really change things in terms of the story or the flavor text.
It doesn't. It's not necessary. It's not necessary in a modern age. I get it. Absolutely.
Yes.
So for an approaching new player, I noticed that you went through and sort of reworked the rule book as well to make it more approachable. Because like you said, those 90s days were wild west of collectible card games. A lot of these companies were only doing, were brand new to writing rule books, and they were as clunky as could be, right?
The original series of rule books repeated themselves a lot in very strange ways, it seemed like. And there was some of the rules were not in places that you would expect them. And some of the other, like how like battle works, like as a general whole, was not really explained very well to begin with. Like was this big fact that really like broke down how an action during battle that does damage, like how you handle that. And the very specific breakdown and as to why things are the way they are was never in the rule book. They're like, just like, well, people will figure it out, or that's what a fact is for. But with this kind of style of release, where I'm less like, no, everything should be self-contained. And we went to great lengths to kind of make sure that everything that appears in the game is explained in the rule book in one way or the other, even if it's just like a mention, even if it's a thing that's, like there are certain keywords that they don't have any sort of like effects, but other cards in the set in the game like will react to that keyword, if it comes up. So, but like stuff like that just wasn't really explained. It was just like, oh, this is a thing.
I remember like online versions of those rule books, like for those games, that were like basically like a choose your own adventure. Like you'd read the rules section and then it says at the end, if you have a question about this, turn to FAQ page 67 or something like that. You have to go and read every other card's problem before you got to the problem that you actually were looking to solve. So I'm so glad that you ended up putting that and streamlining that. And I also saw that it might not be the rule book, there was another set that's available with the set itself, another piece of PDF that you've actually made it accessible for people to have sort of starter decks, like to sort of get a feel for the game. Do you want to tell me about how that came about?
Those starter decks are basically just whatever the original prepackaged starters were. And because of what the minimum deck requirements is, I'm just like, just take whatever came in the starter deck, add in like 5 cards that you want to use, and go ahead and start there and have fun.
Well, much like in Legend of the Five Rings, obviously Legend of the Burning Sands has factions or clans as well. Yeah. So there's a list for each one of those clans, and you can sort of choose whichever one and then find the cards that correspond to that, print it out, and take whatever you like. Like if you want to play assassins, that's really cool. Or if you want to play a bunch of other themes, that's all built into the game.
Yeah, it's just like I always really like that. Like again, it's that Middle Eastern 1001 Arabian Nights kind of feel to it, and there's a lot of really cool, like it's just a really cool genre. Even looking back to some of the Dungeons and Dragons that I play, like everyone's favorite Dungeons and Dragons theme, Dark Sun. Like there you go. Hey, we're all stranded alone in the desert.
Yeah, it is a definitely interesting little facet of like pop culture and fantasy culture as well, because it has things like that make an appearance in the game as well, like genies and djinns as they call them in that sort of fiction and stuff. So it's super interesting in that regard. And obviously Magic the Gathering even had Arabian Nights as well as its first ever expansion. So there's a lot of interest in that sort of fantasy setting.
Yeah.
So you've got this new set out. So Is there anything that you changed that would be noticed by people who were returning to the game, like legacy players who were really into the game initially? Was there something that you changed, or something that you feel like that they would bump up against or be surprised by or excited by?
Like there was some terminology that we renamed instead of having, because one of the things that always seemed super goofy to me about Legend of the Five Rings and Legend of the Burning Sands was just like, all right, every turn you get a chance to take actions, and you use that action to play an action.
You mean you do an action to play a card called an action?
Yeah, so just like we changed the name of a couple of card types, specifically like the action card type, it's called an order. Like Legend of the Five Rings, even eventually I think they started calling them strategies at some point. So there's that, and so having we changed the term reaction to reflex, which is just like something came, that again captures that same kind of feel to it, but has a word that makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, it's more flavorfully immersive.
We also put in some terminology to kind of shorten card text, where instead of like, you don't bring a hero into play, you recruit a hero. Because bring into play is like a whole phrase. Like, hey, let's condense that whole down to like one word, if we can avoid it. Followers are enlisted to heroes. Items are equipped by heroes rather than like attached to, or so it's just like providing a little bit more context in terms of game mechanics as to what is. So like when you see enlist, you're like, oh, that this card affects a follower versus something else.
Yeah, well, like you said, these terms that were getting thrown around between two different development groups and stuff like that were probably not as streamlined as they needed to be, straight on. So you've obviously gone through and ironed all that out. And like I said, I took a look. It looks fantastic so far. And I think that there'd be a lot for like good returning players. Are you hoping that people play this as its own sealed sort of, game, or are you happy or expecting people to mix it in with pre-existing Legend of the Burning Sands cards?
My whole idea is like this is an entire just a sealed environment. Like yes, you can still play the new cards, or the cards that I've done with cards that other people had, or with the original cards, but in terms of just holistically,
almost like a living card game, in a sense, you can take it out and build whatever you want from it and play from it.
Yeah, rather than because that was originally too the challenge with mixing the old cards with the new cards would be that a lot of terminology has changed, and it just doesn't necessarily fit the same aesthetic.
Okay, so in that case, with that in mind, that you were able to create your own environment, your own mechanical environment by sealing this off. Was there anything that you felt I'm not too familiar with the history of Legend of the Five Rings' balance, but was there anything that you took the liberty to rebalance, things that might have been problems in the original set?
Not really. I really just want to preserve, Legend of the Burning Sands as a whole, and just tidy up the way it's described versus issue oh wow, this strategy was super broken. It can't, I'm gonna write that out of the game.
So you sort of touched on it before, but recently in just putting this in the larger context of collectible card games and what's going on since Legend of the Burning Sands came out, you extracted Wizards of the Coast basically banned some cards because they were inappropriate with a modern context. You said before that you had removed some, unsavory, depictors or unsavory monikers that the game itself gave. Was there anything else larger that you had to take out? Was there any art you didn't want to include? Was there anything else that you felt that really needed to be changed from where we were 20 years ago to releasing a game now?
I didn't really need to pull anything else. And the other thing too is that another card game I play has been removing art from its cards and replacing it from somebody who is basically, he's a Nazi at this point. So hey, we're not going to pay that guy royalties. We're going to replace his art. And on one hand, I didn't really dig too deep into any of the politics of any of the artists for the cards, mostly because like I'm not paying anyone. No one is making money off of this.
You shouldn't need to as well, but obviously, if you hear about something, obviously you'd have to be aware of that.
Yeah, and like the idea is that like this is not really, like Legend of the Burning Sands really isn't even a thing. I'm not making money off of it, so I can't really be sued for damages.
Yeah.
So I didn't, change the art. Like, slavery's a theme throughout the whole thing. And, I'm a little uncomfortable with, with me, like personally, because, I'm a straight white dude. I'm like, hey, I shouldn't really be telling these kinds of stories. It's not really my place to do that. But it's still like, it works within the context of the game. One of the things that the editor and I went back, had a conversation with actually was Jin, the magical creatures that are basically smokeless fire. And at some point, I'm like, so what sort of pronouns should I actually be using? And because, Jin are still like thinking, feeling creatures, but they're
genderless.
Well, they're magical constructs too. So just like, my intention was to like be, to be as, compassionate to everyone that I can. And just like referring to Jin as it, where it's just like, that seems like way too edgelordy that I'm prepared to go. So I ended up just making sure like anytime like a Jin gets referred to it's gender neutral pronouns, they, them, which I don't know, on some certain cards too, like, the heroes that are depicted are different genders. And it's like, hey, it's cool. But just like his or her.
Right. Yeah. You mean like referring to player or something like that?
Referring to a player, referring to a particular hero, or even like a follower, where it could be a group of people. A single follower card could represent a group of people. So using like a gender neutral they, them really helped, again, trim down card text where it was needed, or at least unnecessary to like spell things out. And it was really the thing that kind of clinched it for me, like at least referring to genres, was like they are still thinking beings.
Right. They're still sentient.
Yeah. You can be sentient but not have free will. But you should still like kind of like respect this is in most cases like an actual person, even though they might not have a lot of leeway in their actions.
So my question to you now is, like, obviously sounds like there was, you obviously took that modern sensibility and gave it to this game, but was there anything super challenging or anything in the remaster that you maybe really struggle with, or was there something that you did really want to do but found out you couldn't because it didn't make sense if you kept this as a sealed environment? Like, was there anything that stands out to you in your memory of like, wow, this was a real hurdle to get over?
Not really. Like mechanically, like the game's actually very sound mechanically, and it was not super difficult to kind of rearrange everything and redescribe everything, the mechanics of the game. Like the biggest challenge to the project as a whole was getting a hold of scans for the Awakening for the art. About a third of the scans that I got are just like they're barely usable, and it was just like it's what I had available, so I used them. Hopefully, we'll be able to start getting, new good scans, because I pulled everything all the artwork that I pulled off of, got from scans from oracleofthevoid.com. And it was just like, I'm like, okay, here, I'll just pull them from here. These are the best things that I've seen. One person from a Facebook group, actually, because there's a handful of missing cards even from his collection on Oracle of Void. And there's like, I think somebody from France ended up sending me a couple of scans of cards, that just straight up were not to be found on the internet at all.
So while we're talking about production, and things like printing and scanning. How do you suggest somebody who's discovering this remaster? Because like you said, this is a fan set. You're not making any money on it. It's literally online as PDFs or individual card images and stuff like that. How do you suggest, or how do you personally create these cards as far as a proxy element goes? Like, do you print them on a printer? Do you like, what's your preferred method? And what suggestions do you have for people who might be stumbling across it and doing proxy stuff for the first time?
So for just like generic proxying stuff, there's two different sets of cards available. There's cards that have a bleed for printing, and there are cards without bleed. The cards without bleed are designed to be printed on a piece of paper. They're the exact shape that a cut card would be. So you print it out, at the the right size on a sheet of paper. You should be able to fit 9 cards. Cards are approximately 2.5 by 3.5. Regular standard poker size playing card. You should be able to print out 9 cards to a page, and then cut them down, shove them in a card sleeve, and be able to play. The other set of cards are actually much higher quality as well. They're the cards for just printing on paper are max quality JPEGs. So they're still about almost a megabyte per card, but the other ones are like 3 to 4 megabytes per card. It's just a different format that's a little bit better suited to card printing. There's a bunch of websites out there where you can like print your own actual playing cards. But when you're printing stuff on cardstock and for a playing card, they actually cut out a border where the card gets stamped out of the cardboard. So each of these card images has a bleed, which is basically like extra space around the outside of the card to kind of like create a margin of error in case there's like some sort of cutting issue. And a lot of like, there's historically, like going back to Magic and stuff, like there's a lot of misprint and miscut cards where just like, oh, hey, the die cutter missed the mark on this one. I got, half of a disenchant and half of a force of nature.
So that's why card like Magic traditionally have like a solid black border. Pokemon has a yellow border. Other games and stuff do the whole like border, solid border. But Legend of the Burning Sands has, I think, art right up to the edge of the card, right?
It's art right up to the edges, which, again, it's even like Legend of the Five Rings had art right up to the edges, but it was much more subtle because each expansion had kind of its own border, which, again, I thought that was like just a really clever way of doing things.
Yeah, so that was how you told expansions apart, right? The interesting design around the actual border of the card, which I thought that's actually quite genius, and I don't think anyone's done it since.
No, well, I mean, up until the point to where just like even if you're doing like expansion icons, or just like how, all right, like especially too like for certain, depending on the theme of your game, like how do you come up with like a little 1/8 of an inch icon that's going to be visually distinct, but also recognizable from across the table?
Of course. So, so you would say that the best thing is either just, print them out on like, put them all together on a Word document, print them out and then sleeve them behind an actual card, like in sleeves or use labels?
Yeah. I mean, card sleeves, I mean, I don't know of any, collectible card game of this day and age that doesn't have like even a handful of sleeves just kind of kicking around. It's, that's the way that I see most people, using the game. The print cards are there mostly because like I have to work out of Photoshop and everything else. So it's just like, it's just as easy for me to include it. And like for somebody that, wants to actually have the physical cards, I can give them the means to have that and have like the highest possible quality, for their prints.
That's fantastic. So I also noticed when I was looking at some of the cards, you've taken some of the icons and reorientated them on the card for sort of the ease of use. Do you want to talk to me about a little bit about what decisions went into that process, like the water icons and stuff like that changed orientation? Do you want to tell me a bit about that?
It really wasn't much anything other than I couldn't figure out a way to make everything, because the original Legend of the Burning Sands layout had its strength and its Ka, which is their basically force and chi. So the Legend of the Burning Sands layout mirrored exactly the old Legend of the Five Rings layout, with the exception that the middle icons, which are water on the original printing, it's water, copper, influence, but influence is kind of its own stat, just as important as strength or Ka. So I wanted to make sure that that was like, oh, hey, this is a main stat that should go with the others. And finding a way to represent that on the card that also too, like, you can fan your cards out a little bit. So it's just like, you can still kind of see all of the vital information, like if you're, that's on the left-hand side of the card. And it just makes it a little bit easier, a little bit more of an ease of use thing, rather than having to sit there and cycle through your whole hand to kind of like just reference, different costs or values on the card.
Okay, well, I think that's a really genius idea. Most card games, obviously, Magic has always kept their thing in the top right-hand corner, but having things listed on that left side of the card, for most right-handed people, that's the way that they fan out their card, and they can just identify what card it is so quickly from, those values or stuff being along that edge. So jumping from the physical side to the digital side, do you have any hopes that Legend of the Burning Sands Remastered will have any, say, digital presence? Like, are you working towards putting it on, say, Tabletop Simulator or something that people can play on card games online or digital?
That is eventually, a part of the plan. I have a Lackey CCG plugin that's 70% ready to go. I put it together last year, so I'd have to basically go through and replace all of the cards with the updated ones that I've worked over. I really started the big push, I want to say it was the beginning of March, to go through and just kind of re-edit myself. And then I hired Rachel to edit as well at the end of March. And we spent most of the month of April just going through and editing, and I was changing minor tweaks in the typeface and of the text in the text box and the typeface of the card titles, to get the best, to have that same classic feel, but still be the best readable solution.
Most accessible, most makes sense solution.
And also too, going back to the icons and stuff, I put quite a bit of thought into thematic stuff, and also too trying to make things a little bit more colorblind accessible, where thematically you have strength is the sun, moon is the spirit or the Ka, and then influence is stars. So I have sun, moon, stars, but it's also yellow, cyan, or yellow, magenta, cyan in terms of things. So it's just there's a little different, that was somebody might look at that and just say, oh, that looks cool, but that was actually a very deliberate design choice.
That's actually ingenious. I love it. That's great.
Yes.
So I guess my ultimate question this evening is, I really hope that this does, reach the bounds and reach the people that you want it to. What is your ultimate, if you could have it exactly the way you want it to go, what do you want to come from Legend of the Burning Sands Remastered?
I don't know, I did it for the community at large. So it's just I don't, obviously some personal recognition would be really nice, going through. Originally what I'd wanted to do was actually start doing new Legend of the Burning Sands stuff, but then coming through that particular intellectual property and being able to get rights to it is a little much, especially too with the current state of flux that Legend of the Five Rings is in, where it's just FFG is no longer supporting the game. So I'm that's not really a head. That's 5 separate headaches that I just don't want to have. Meanwhile, I actually do know somebody that has an IP that that translates really well to the mechanics of the game. And I'm I could actually just talk to this person and say hey, what do you think about this? Or I can just, make up just a handful of decks and go to him okay, I'm going to teach you how to play a game. And then use his own, themes and IP, and then see where that goes.
Okay. I mean, I definitely, it's a good way to sort of start testing these mechanics in a larger sense. And like you said, you did it for the community, and I'm sure they're very, very grateful. Like, do you hope to see Gen Con and stuff like that, tournaments? Like, would that be something that you'd be interested in traveling to and hosting?
Honestly, like that would be seeing stuff at like Gen Con, or like, like that's like so utterly mind blowing. Like I can't even really comprehend anything like that. That would be like a level of success that I'm just like not prepared for.
Well, I mean, it's such a great game. It has the legacy of like, L5R behind it and stuff like that. Maybe, much like the Star Wars player committee, maybe that there'll be a little bit of traction caught on with this proxy community, and hopefully some new people discover the game and you'll be able to put together some tournaments and stuff like that. I really do hope that with all the work you've just explained that you put into it, that's the sort of traction that it finds.
Yeah, I mean, that would be absolutely amazing.
So, well, talking to that, I see, obviously you've got a ton of proxy techniques yourself and stuff. Would you be interested, or do you think that the set that you've made, like as far as remastered goes, would be adequate if you were to, sort of combine them into booster pack piles or something like that for drafting for this sort of game? Or is that not something that you think Legend of the Burning Sands was really designed for?
Like personally, I'm not a fan of drafting cards. Like I just
Yep.
At my absolute best, I'm a mediocre deck builder.
I can relate to that.
Draft, like I'm sure that there's different things that can come up with that other people can come up with for like drafting for Legend of the Burning Sands. Drafting is not my cup of tea, so it's not really something that because I would be really remiss to like put effort into a mechanic or an idea that I don't really believe. Like I'm not really into it. So it's like I don't want to make crappy draft rules for people that enjoy draft, like actually really know and have a really good mind of what makes good draft and what makes bad draft. So I'm like, I don't want to step on anyone's toes when it comes to that.
No, I understand. And I understand that balancing an environment for draft you think balancing an environment for constructed is hard, but balancing an environment for draft is double a headache and stuff like that. And I don't know if AEG and Wizards of the Coast was really pushing that with the original Legend of the Legend of the Burning Sands. I think I've done it a couple of times. Legend of the Burning Sands originally. So they may not, that environment, even the cards from it may not have really been balanced for that sort of thing. So I guess my last question of the interview, oh my God, thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your time. But my last question of the core interview is, if obviously now you know the trouble and the difficulty of remastering something like that, but is there another collectible card game you would want to take a swing at? Imagining that we had another infinite amount of time or something like that. Is there another collectible card game that you would want to try and remaster yourself out of a personal project or otherwise?
Yeah, actually, like I said, the part of my impetus behind taking on Legend of the Burning Sands, like it's the best game that I never really got a chance to play.
Yeah.
And I actually really liked the aesthetics of the old Cult CCG.
Oh my, yes.
So, depending on what happens, over the next 10 or 15 years, we might see, Cult remastered. But that also too has, you want to talk about cards not being able to be found or hard to find. And actually, I believe from what little research I put into it, the game was much more popular like in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yep, in France and stuff where the RPG was popular.
So if I were to do such a like that's like, again, I did this so that I could play the game, and I might as well share it with other people if I'm putting all this work into it. But yeah, Cult is definitely like were I to do this again for another game, Cult would probably be it.
That's amazing. I had Cult designer Brian Winter on the show, and he said that he thought that it was probably the best mechanics. He designed 5 collectible card games, and he said that one was personally his favorite. And he's actually tried a couple of times to sort of get a reworked version, a little bit more socially, because Cult has a lot of very aggressive visual images in it, which I personally love. But he's tried to work what he calls a fluffy bunny version of Cult into the mass market, like into a bigger market. But I would love to see that. You would have my full support on doing a remaster of Cult. I think you've just committed to something that the fans are going to pursue you about now.
Well, hey, there's worse problems to have.
So, all right. Well, that's been our episode for today. Thank you so much for joining me, Chris.
Thanks a lot for having me. This is like the weirdest thing that I've ever done.
I would love just to say thank you, goodbye from me, and I will put all the links to Legend of the Burning Sands Remastered in the description below or in the description of the podcast. Thank you so much for sharing the origins and stories of this particular project.
Goodbye, everyone. Have fun.
And there you have it. That's our episode with Chris Malec about his fan remastering of Legend of the Burning Sands. I've taken a look and the set looks amazing. You can find links to it in the description below. Or if you'd like, take a look at our other episodes. You will find the episode with Brian Winter, the designer of Cult I mentioned at the end there. And you'll also find episodes with AEG leader and the man responsible for Legend of the Burning Sands originally, and L5R and several other CCGs, John Zinzer. We have a couple of episodes with those where he actually answers questions about those properties. Now, as for me, I have one request from you. If you have any suggestions for the show, whether it be guests or topics, such as TCG specifically, you want to hear about in our core regular booster pack episodes and interviews, let us know. Or if you happen to know other fan-related CCG projects or topics, let us know in the comments below, and we may be able to do an episode on those like this one with those suggestions. The other thing is as well, we'll be back with a new episode of the Booster Pack next week. I can't wait to bring it to you. Not only does it have a ton of great stories about CCGs, but also a ton of great stories about hobby gaming at large. So keep an eye out for that. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. It is a fantastic and in-depth episode. So until then, I'm going to have to say, as I always do at the end of these, keep shuffling.